Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of The Dravidian Does History, the audio version. My name is Arjun, and I'll be discussing Indian history primarily in this podcast, and eventually we'll deal with other world histories and maybe even prehistory. Dinosaurs may make an appearance, other beasts from the past might make an appearance, politics might make an appearance, but primarily what I'll be talking about would be Indian history and the context of Indian history with the rest of the world. The reason behind this podcast is that I wrote a book last year. The book is called The Lords of India, and it's volume one. It tells the story of Indian history from roughly around 1500 BCE till 1700 CE. It traces the origins of Indian states and discusses the evolution of imperial states within the Indian context until the end of the greatest of these imperial edifices under the rule of one of the last Indian emperors. That story is a way to tell the history of India, traveling across the length of breadth of the subcontinent and talking about all different dynasties, all different groups of people, all different linguistic groups, and all different cultures, and not just focusing on one area, language, culture, or religion. Now, the question arises, why did I write a book about Indian history? The idea came to me when I went to India in the summer of 2024. I had been living in Canada for 5 years at the time, and I had finally got my permanent residence and decided to go back and visit some of the places that I had read about in books and had visited as a child, but never had the opportunity to see with the eyes of somebody who loves and reads history. I went to Delhi, I went to Agra primarily because my interests at the time lay in the Mughal and Delhi Sultanate era monuments. Those were the monuments I wanted to see firsthand because that was the area that I had researched the most in the last few years. So I went to Agra and I went to the Agra fort and I was looking out over the Yamuna at the Taj Mahal. That's when I heard some of the guides talking to the foreign visitors as well as domestic tourists and expressing some of their ideas about the various buildings within the Agra fort complex and the stories of the people who lived in it. And that's when I realized that they were talking absolute bollocks. That angered me and it also disappointed me. The very fact that Indians are not particularly aware of a lot of India's history, be it regional histories, be it imperial histories, be it linguistic histories, be it religious histories, it shocked and surprised me, but it also disappointed me. And then when I came back to Canada, I had a lot of discussion with a lot of Indians who I had the opportunity to talk to at my workplace and in places where I went in the public. And in these conversations, again, I realized that a lot of people did not have a good handle of India's history. We all studied history in school, but apparently most of us didn't pay attention. People were familiar with the names of certain dynasties, people were familiar with certain movements, but locating them in the whole framework of Indian history seems to have been an impossibility. Even more problematic was the fact that a lot of the history that the people did know was focused on Delhi and North India, and the regional histories, even of imperial states in the Deccan and South India, was entirely ignored, even when people seemed to know names like the Cholas and the Vijayanagara. So I thought, how do I rectify this problem? I could recommend books to people, but I have been recommending books to people all my life, and hardly anyone ever picks any up. Maybe because my interest might be a little niche, but still, what could I do about it? I had been reading history for about 2 decades at this point, and I had all this information in my head, and I could discuss history with my friends and people who were interested, but every time I talked about something, I realized that how come they don't know this? I thought this was common knowledge. And then I watched videos on YouTube of historians doing interviews and academics talking about the same problem, that what they considered to be common knowledge was not so common. And I thought, okay, I may not be an official academic historian, but I do have a lot of historical information in my head. And maybe I'll be able to communicate this in a simple, easy to understand language to people like me who are interested in history. To the other people who I talk to, they seem to be interested in history. They just hadn't had the opportunity to talk about history or read history from that perspective. Maybe I could be the person who puts down this history in an interesting way for the average person who I could talk to. Maybe if I talk to history in that simplistic tone, maybe people will be able to get into history. Maybe I could be the person who wrote history in such a way that people use that as a springboard to read further and expand their ideas of history and read more history and finally get acquainted with the vast, wonderful history of India. So I thought, okay, this will be a good thing. What further solidified the idea that I should start writing a book on history and maybe even talk about it a lot more was the realization that there were a lot of controversies about history that was going on in India. One of the first things I remember is the controversy around the movie Padmavat when it came out, when it did, and how the sets were attacked and people were threatening the actress Deepika Padukone with bodily harm. And it reminded me how India is such a volatile country, particularly about historic and religious topics, but then people don't really have any handle on history and how and why and where it should be discussed. Another controversy that I remembered was when people were threatening the makers of the TV show The Empire, which aired on Hotstar, which discussed the life of the Mughal emperors. And the first season, the only season that aired so far, showed the life of Babur. And I realized that people were not willing to discuss the Mughals in any capacity at this time. And this was a few years ago. And only last year we came across the huge controversy that was lighted by the release of the movie Chava, which discussed the history of Aurangzeb Alamgir, the last Padishah of the Mughal dynasty, with any significant power, and that of Chhatrapati Shivaji. So, again, in the current situation, in this political climate, people couldn't discuss history without being volatile and attacking each other. And the history that they were discussing wasn't even quite true. So I thought, it is high time that we start discussing history in more detail and with more understanding and start asking questions that may be a little difficult, but that's the only way that we can move forward. Then I asked the question, why is it so hard to discuss Indian history? Most of the time, when I go to YouTube or any podcasts or interviews, when I hear what people are talking about history, it's always sensationalized for the most part. I shouldn't say always. For the most part, it's always sensationalized, and people fixate on religious or communal or regional histories. Why is it like that? Why can't we have a general history of India that is easy to understand and easy to discuss, like, for example, the history of England or the history of ancient Egypt? The history of ancient Egypt lasted for about 4,000 years, and we are able to go down the line of all the kings and queens who ruled from their different capitals within the land that is ancient Egypt. But we are not able to do that about India. We can pinpoint the specific periods of English history, but we can't do the same about Indian history without going specific about regions or dynasties. The reality was that Indian history is extraordinarily complicated and varied because Indian history is really long. Recorded history is at least 3,000 years old. And if we think about history that is not recorded in written records, and we think about oral histories and mythological histories, and also history that is recorded in the different languages, like the early Indo European languages, we go even further back. Archaeological history, it discusses eras that maybe occurred 5,000 years ago. So it's a really long period of history to be dissected and discussed in a short form, in a linear form, and in an easily palatable form. Then there is also the fact that Indian history is extraordinarily varied. For example, if you look at the English history that we are taught in schools, it looks complicated, but in reality, it's fairly straightforward. The current dynasty that allegedly rules England can trace their ancestry back to Alfred the Great, and it's almost a straight line. They just have they can discuss the history of England through these dynasties, through the different kings, through the different queens, and through the different political movements that happened because England is a teeny tiny country. If we place England right next to India, you will see the huge difference in size. India is about the size of the European Union itself. So when we discuss European history, it's comparable to discussing Indian history. There are different dynasties existing at the same time. There are different empires existing within what is historical South Asia, which is India, existing at the same time with equal power that is larger than some of the greatest empires in the world. Then there's also the fact that there is no unifying dynasty that traces its history from ancient time to the present day, unlike the history, for example, of Japan, where a single dynasty can trace its ancestry from the earliest of its days. For example, the history of China, even though it's a huge place, for most of its history, it has been unified under one dynasty or one state and only had sporadic episodes of disunity. The case of India is the exact opposite. We have only had one or two occasions where more than 60 or 70% of the landmass of South Asia has been occupied and controlled by one dynasty or one state. But throughout most of India's history for the last 5,000 years, it has been a collection of independent sovereign states, and the histories have also been different, therefore. There is also the problem that legitimate sources discussing Indian history are harder to come by than, example, if you discussed Egyptian history. Writing existed in ancient Egypt far longer than history of India itself has existed. Ancient Egypt was a unified state with a pharaoh at the throne, controlling the whole resources of that state of Kemet or ancient Egypt far longer than the history of India has entirely encapsulated the evolutions and civilizations that existed in this landmass. So, how do we discuss it? So that's how I came to the idea of discussing Indian history by locating it in the paradigm of discussing the largest states that existed in India at any given period of time. Because then we can discuss Indian history in context of these larger states. For example, if you are discussing the 17th century, the largest state in India at the time was the Mughal state of Hindustan. Now we can discuss that dynasty and that state, and we can discuss the rest of India and the world in the context of how they dealt with this state that existed in India. We can discuss how South India and the Tamil states, or the Malayali states, or the Maratha states, or Punjab, and all these areas looked at themselves and positioned themselves in opposition to or in association with the Mughal Empire and the Mughal state. Again, if we go to the 3rd century BCE, we can discuss the history of the Magadhan Empire under the Mauryas, and then having them in context as the linchpin, we can talk the history of the rest of India and how the rest of the world operated around it. And if they had contact with the rest of the world, if there were trade relations, what were the cultural exchanges that happened during this period? So I thought that would be a good way to discuss the entirety of India's history by focusing on the largest or more powerful state that existed in India at any particular point of time. It gives us something to latch on to, and then we can discuss the rest of the history around it and the political maneuverings around it and bring out interesting points. It also allowed for the fact that it was not always a North Indian dynasty that was the largest and most powerful state in India at any given point in time. Case in point, during the 10th to the 13th century, the most powerful state in India was not a North Indian state, but it was the Chola Empire of South India, a Tamilian dynasty that controlled most of the Deccan and below, and also had huge influence in the matters going on in Southeast Asia as well, and controlled the trade routes that was used by countries as far away as China and nations in Europe. So that was a good way to discuss Indian history and not focus on one region or one language or one group of people. My intentions through these audio pieces, I might call them lectures, I might call them podcasts, it's just me talking history. My intentions behind this is to be able to discuss the trends and evolutions of Indian society, be it economic, political, linguistic, geographic, or religious. It is my attempt to understand how we ended up being what we are today. How did the different languages evolve? How did the different religious traditions evolve? How did the political system that is what we have today with a prime minister controlling the government while there is a president, how did that come about? Why do we follow certain customs? And why is Hinduism, for example, practiced in different ways throughout the country, even though it's considered to be one religion? How is it that Buddhism evolved in India but has almost entirely vanished from the country? How is it that Islam as a religion is considered quite violent in northern India, but in southern India, the context is entirely different? How did that happen? Why is it that the Dravidian languages are so different from the Indo Aryan languages that occupy the northern half of India? All of these matters are to be discussed throughout the many episodes that I plan to make for these discussions. And hopefully, I'll be able to engage the audience and have discussions about topics that are interesting to the audience and shed some light on the events and the evolutions that happen. And maybe lighten a little bit of interest in topics, in persons, in events, in occurrences, and maybe even literature and poetry and religious movements and such that we'll come face to face throughout the many episodes that I plan to make for this series. My attention will be primarily on discussing the political movements because I may be using them as a tool to discuss the movements that are impacted by the political movements, be it religious, be it cultural, be it linguistic, be it economic. All of this will be touched upon, but the focus will primarily be on the largest states that exist in India at any given point of time and the people who control these states, and through them discuss the various social, political, economic, religious, and cultural movements that happen throughout India. And I hope that listeners will be entertained as well as informed. And my greatest wish is that people will take some nugget of information that I presented in any of these audio files or these lectures or these discussions and use that as a springboard to dive into the warm, welcoming, vast waters of Indian history that is just waiting for everybody to come and explore it. It is so interesting. It is so diverse. It will have something for everyone. If only you take the time to look into it, to explore it, to try to enlighten ourselves and to discuss and have open discussions about it. There may be arguments. I may make points that might incense people. I may make points that might be quite dull and boring and quite controversial at the same time. But that's the only way we can discuss history, by asking questions, by dismantling established narratives, by countering historical revisionism, and by making sure that we have resources available for everybody to go and check out further information. I will be providing information about books that one can focus on and read further. I'm hoping that people will pay attention to the information that is provided in these videos, even if it's absolute rubbish and you do not agree with any of it. If that inspires you to go ahead and find more information, my goal would have been accomplished. So, I am taking this opportunity to welcome everyone to join me on this journey of discussing India's history from about 2000 BCE up until 2025. Maybe, but my primary focus will be up until 1700s because that's when the last of the Indian empires comes to an end and our political system goes haywire, and then eventually we get taken over by a foreign power, and then the whole monarchic system tumbles down and the Republic of India is created. I will attempt to contextualize Indian history with world history so that we can align ourselves in different periods of time and understand what was happening in the rest of the world at the same time. So we can position ourselves and discuss world history at the same time so that we also know how far along were we in the civilizational development, not just in a context of ourselves, but also in comparison to the world. We often hear Indians say that we were way ahead of the curve. We invented so many things. But through this journey, we'll be discussing these inventions and discussing the position of India as a global superpower for much of world history and how that kind of ended by the coming of the European evolution and explosion in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how India's position as the premier state in the world stage kind of took a backseat, and how we can always re-emerge as world order reestablishes itself around Asian civilizations and states, including China, Japan, and India. So I welcome you to join me on this tour of India's history from its earliest kingdoms to its last great empire. Welcome to Dravidian Does History. My name is Arjun. Hope you have a wonderful day. See you next time.